This is Clover, and I'm here because Simon recently solved my killer cage Sudoku called Everest on cracking the cryptic, and he invited me to make a short video where I come on the channel and talk a little bit about how his solution differed from my quote-unquote intended solve path for this puzzle, and differed from how I kind of conceptualized what was happening in this puzzle while I was setting it. So hopefully it's interesting for you guys to see a little bit of how diverse the ways that you can actually conceptualize different deductions in Sudoku can be, even if you end up with the exact same conclusions at the end. I warned Simon this would probably be a short video on my part, because after the first one, maybe two steps, my solve path and his solve path converge, so they're pretty similar through the entire rest of the video. But I'm going to lay out how Simon handled the opening just so we have a basis to talk about the differences between that and what was going on in my head with this puzzle. So Simon starts towards the beginning of his video solve by noticing that these two cages in the puzzle are significant. And you can see that I've actually removed everything that we're not going to think about yet from the puzzle in this window. Simon notices that these cages are forced, so a 22 cage in 6 cells has to contain the digits 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, and a 21 cage in 6 cells has to contain the digits 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. From there, what Simon does is really interesting. He focuses in on these green cells, which are in the 2 cages but outside of box 1. And Simon's argument about these green cells goes like this. He says, first of all, I've observed that those green cells have to have at least 1, 1, at least 1, 2, at least 1, 3, and so on up to 5. And the reason we know that is because if, for instance, neither of these little green sections had a 1, so if we didn't have a 1 in the green cells at all, the puzzle would break immediately because we still have to put 1s in both cages, and that would leave us having to put 2 1s in box 1, which is not allowed by Sudoku. So we know there has to be a 1 in the green cells, a 2 in the green cells, and so on up to 5. So what is the 6th number? And Simon identifies 2 cases. So he says either the 6th number is a repeat, so there's another copy of 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 in those green cells to make up our 6th value. Or alternatively, the 6th number is a new value and there are no repeats, meaning either the 6th number is a 6 and it's down here, or the 6th number is a 7 and it's up here. And Simon sets out to try to disprove that second case. What he says is, suppose that we have no repeats in the green cells. Then, just for the sake of argument, say that we've got a 1, here. You could put it anywhere in the green cells. If that's the case, then you know, because there are no repeats, we're arguing, you know there's not a 1 anywhere else in the green cells. You know there's not a 1 anywhere else in the 22 cage because we've already put 1, 1 in there. And that means that a 1 has to go here in the 21 cage. So if we put a 1 here in these green cells in box 2, we also have to put a 1 in the top part of the 21 cage. And as long as a digit doesn't repeat, that's the case for every single number from 1 through 5. And by Sudoku, if you have, for instance, a 2 here and a 2 here, you have a 2 in row 2 and you have a 2 in row 3, that puts a 2 into box 3 in row 1. Similarly, if we're doing the same thing with a 3, we have a 3 here and we have a 3 there, for instance. That puts a 3 there in box 7. If we have a 1 here and a 1 there, that puts a 1 there in box 7. And because with no repeats, this would happen with every single digit in the grid. From 1 through 5, of course. Not every single digit, but every single digit from 1 through 5. Then we would end up knowing that we had to have somewhere in these pink cells, we had to have the digits 2, 3, 4, and 5. But the problem, or 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, the problem there, of course, is that 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are 5 digits that only sum up to 15. And to have 2 3-cell cages that total 14 and 18, that's a total of 32. And if 5 of them only sum up to 15, the 6th one has to literally have the digit 17 in it to work. So Simon says, based on that, I can conclude that there are repeats in these green cells. Because if you remember, Simon started with the assumption that there weren't any repeats in the green cells. And if there aren't any repeats in the green cells, then the puzzle breaks in that way. You end up having to have a 17 digit in the pink cells. So at that point, Simon is around here. He hasn't removed his 7 and 6 pencil marks from his, in his case, yellow cells, but that's where he is at this point. And his argument from there goes like this. At this point, we've already observed that digits in these cells that I've colored green, if they don't repeat in the green cells, we do have a scenario where that digit gets forced into one of these 2 pink cages. For instance, if we know that 2 doesn't repeat, then if we place a 2 here in the green cells, we also end up with a 2 here, which forces a 2 into the 18 cage. We have the digits 1 through 5, and exactly one of them repeats. The other 4 don't repeat, which means that the digits 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4 of them end up getting forced into either the 14 or the 18 cage. And then Simon does a little more arithmetic. He says, well, I've got 4 digits from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The absolute biggest I can possibly make the sum of those 4 digits is 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5. That's 14. So in order to go from 14 to 32 in these 6 cells, my last 2 cells have to be as big as possible. They have to both be 9. In other words, these 6 cells are 2, 3, 4, 5, and 2 9s. What Simon observes is that to make an 18 here with a 9 and 2 of those digits, the only way to do it is 4, 5, 9. And likewise down here, the only way to make a 14 with 9 and 2 of those digits is to go minimal with the small digits and go for 2, 3, 9. And from there, Simon's solve path and mine end up converging pretty quickly, but I want to talk to you about how I visualized this because I think it's different from how Simon looks at it. And I'm going to start by showing you the baby version of Everest, which I've called Fuji, because I think that it's easier to see this deduction if you have fewer moving parts. So what's going on in Fuji is that we have kind of in the same positions, an 11 cage and a 10 cage. So an 11 cage is forced in 4 cells. It has to be 1, 2, 3, 5. A 10 cage is also forced. It has to be 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, I want you to focus on these 2 dark blue cells and these 2 dark green cells. And what we're going to try to do is prove that one of those dark blue cells has to contain a 5, and one of those 2 dark green cells has to contain a 4. So suppose that that wasn't the case. Suppose that, for instance, this 11 cage, these 2 digits up here were 1 and 3. That 1 and 3 cell see almost all of the 10 cage. They actually see 3 of the 4 cells in the 10 cage. So we would have to eliminate 1 and 3 from those cells in the 10 cage, and somehow we would have to put both 1 and 3 at the same time in one cell in the 10 cage. These 2 dark blue cells see 3 out of the 4 cells in the 10 cage, meaning that the only place those 2 dark blue values can go in the 10 cage is here in this cell that's kind of highlighted. I'll highlight it in red now. So that's the only place that those 2 dark blue values can go if they show up in the 10 cage, but we can't put 2 values in one cell. That implies that one of the 2 dark blue values, at least, has to be a number that doesn't show up in the 10 cage at all. And our only option for that, given the cage totals we're working with, is 5. The same thing is true symmetrically. So suppose that with the 10 cage, we did not have a 4 in the dark red cells. Suppose they were like a 2 and a 3. Well, the problem with that is the same as the problem with the 11 cage. The 2 and the 3 now see all but one cell in the 11 cage, but we need to put a 2 and a 3 in there. So we have to put a 2 and a 3 in that cell at the same time. That's impossible. And the only way around that, once again, is if one of these 2 dark green values is a value that we don't have to place in the 11 cage, and our only option to do that is to make it a 4. So what we have again is a scenario where one of the two dark green values is a 4 and another one is repeated in this cell I just highlighted in orange. How does this work in Everest? So Simon's forced cage compositions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're going to still go with blue and green. And I'm still going to color 2 cells dark blue and 2 cells dark green. These 2 dark green cells in the 21 cage see every cell in the 22 cage except for this one that I'm highlighting in orange right now. So if those 2 dark green cells were, for instance, 2 and 5, 2 and 5 would get eliminated from everywhere in the 22 cage except here, but we have to put a 2 and a 5 in that cage. We can't put them both in the same cell, so that total's broken. So the only way to avoid breaking that 22 cage is to make sure that one of the 2 dark green values is a number that we don't have to place in the 22 cage. In other words, one of those 2 numbers is a 6. And by symmetry, one of these 2 dark blue numbers is a 7. I don't love arithmetic and killer puzzles. I tend to go pretty light on the arithmetic. So this was intended to be able to be handled one sum at a time, not having to sum multiple cages together. And what you can actually do is this. You observe, look at the dark green cells. Those 2 cells, one of them is a 6, which is fine. It doesn't have to repeat anywhere. And the other one, let's just say for the sake of argument that it's a 1. That one sees every cell here and every cell here, and so it ends up, because it has to go in the 22 cage somewhere, it ends up getting forced into that position. And that places a 1 up here in the 18 cage because there's nowhere else to put it in row 1. So whatever digit is the twin of the 6 in the dark green cells ends up getting forced into the 18 cage. On top of that, whatever this is sees almost all of the 22 cage as well. We know it has to have a value 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, so we know its value has to be repeated here somewhere. And so say for the sake of argument that this is like a 3, then we know we have to have a 3 in one of these 2 yellow cells, which again forces a 3 into the 18 cage. So we've just identified that there are 2 values, 2 small values, that show up in the 18 cage, whichever one is in yellow, and whichever one is kind of paired with the 6 in the dark green cells. Well, how do you make a total of 18 if you have to use 2 small digits from the range 1 through 5? The only way you can do it, and you can just barely manage to do it, is you can take 4 and 5 as big as possible. 4 plus 5 plus 9, the biggest possible third digit, gives you a sum of 18. And you can also run that backwards at this point. You can say, well, I know that the digits that got forced into that 18 cage were whatever is in yellow, so that's got to be either 4 or 5, and whatever the twin of 6 was. So that also has to be either 4 or 5. And that means we actually have a 4, 5, 6 triple here. This is also going to be 4 or 5 because this has to be the repeat of whatever went in the dark green cells. And from there you can reduce the possibilities for the light green cells, so the cells in the 21 cage that are outside of there. You can also remove 4s and 5s from here, and if you want to be a little sneaky about it, you can now make some deductions based on the fact that we have a 1, 2, 3, 7 quadruple vertically. I think it's more elegant if we kind of use the same exact logic, even though we technically don't need it at this point, to figure out what's in the 14 cage. Well, this cell, this kind of orangey cell now there, that gets repeated in column 3 within the 21 cage, and therefore gets forced into the 14 cage, so that 14 cage definitely has a 1, 2, or 3. And on top of that, whatever value is twinned with the 7 gets repeated here, and also gets forced into the 14 cage. So the 14 cage, we can conclude, has to include 2 digits that are very small, so it has to include at least 2 digits from the range 1, 2, 3. How do we do that? Well, again, we can just barely make it. 2 plus 3, the biggest possible, plus 9, the biggest possible third digit, just sums up to 14. That's a 2-3-7 triple. We now have a 1-4-5 triple in box 2. Now, from this point, my logic and Simon's are very, very similar. But I'm just going to show you how the next move is meant to follow on from this. And the idea is that you have these two other cages that have totals of 14 and 16 here. And we're actually going to use kind of a mirror of the same logic. And Simon does start talking about this kind of reasoning at this point in his solve. If the 14 cage had a 1, a 2, and a 3, then we would have 1, 2, and 3 over here. But that's a problem because 1 plus 2 plus 3 does not sum to 14. However, a 14 cage in 4 cells does have to have at least 2 very small digits. It has to have at least 2 digits from the range 1, 2, 3. Whatever digits they are also appear to the left in the L shape in box 4. And therefore, say there's a 2 there, then there's a 2 there, therefore there's also a 2 over here in the 14 cage. And we already worked out earlier in just the previous step that the only way to make a 14 cage in 3 cells using 2 very small digits is to go for 2, 3, and 9. That means that the digits that are repeated in the 4-sized 14 cage, the one in the middle in box 5, have to be 2 and 3 and cannot be a 1. Once we have a sum of 2 plus 3, that's a total of 5. We have 2 more cells to make a total of 9. That's what's left over to make up a 14. But we can't put a 1 in there. So the only remaining way to make a total of 14 is to go for 2, 3, 4, 5. That in turn places a 4 and 5 in the 16 cage, and a 9, or sorry, not a 9, arithmetic, a 7 to go with it. And that's how I looked at the opening moves to this puzzle. And at the end of the day, I came to the exact same conclusions that Simon did, in the exact same order, and the rest of the solve progressed pretty much identically to what I had in my head while I was setting it. Okay, so that's the opening to Everest. I urge you, if you haven't already, go watch Simon solve of the puzzle and try to solve it yourself. It's kind of a tricky one, especially compared to what I normally set with the gas series. But I think it's a puzzle that has some really kind of interesting and intricate logic to it, and I hope that you enjoy it, and I hope that this showed you some interesting things about kind of how puzzles like this behave. Have a good rest of your day, and thank you so much to Simon and Mark for letting me use your platform to share a little bit about this puzzle.